Hello, good morning everyone. Welcome back to our course, and today we will be talking about sustainability and production. To be honest, this is one of the course that I find to be very challenging, not because the subject is very technical or because the subject is too difficult, but because philosophically, sustainability and production are two opposite things. So for example, sustainability is about retaining our asset, retaining our resources. But with production, we will use our resources. We will exploit our resources. With sustainability, we try to stop, we try to reserve, we try to keep our resources. But with production, we will use our resources, we will exploit our resources, we will make something from our resources. So those two are actually quite opposite. Now the question is whether sustainability and production can stand together. Is it possible to do that, or is it just a rhetoric? So let me begin with the brief history of sustainability. We know that during the 16th to 18th century, there was mercantilism era. In 1760s, there was industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution. In 1930 to 1960, there was green revolution in the US. And in 1990s until present day, there were globalization, financial, and trade liberalization. We also have to take into account the pandemic because from 2020 onwards, there will be significant change. And our new normal will most likely very different compared to the world before COVID-19. So one of the causes of unsustainability is economic development, because throughout the centuries, as I just shown you a minute ago, mankind has tried to improve his own quality of life, many times at the expense of others and the environment. And factors that contribute to economic development approach, including technological advancement, as well as improvement in development perspective. Those two factors are contributing to the economic development. Now let's talk about mercantilism. During 16th to 18th centuries, especially in Europe, there was mercantilism era. What does it mean by mercantilism? Mercantilism means that the source of the wealth of nation is based on valuable metals like gold and silver. So because of this, European countries set out fleets to trade and to colonize other countries. Because they want to gather as much resources as possible, they want to obtain as much gold and silver as possible. And during this mercantilism era, we know the situation as zero-sum game. I win, you lose, or you win, I lose. But back in England, David Hume and Adam Smith argued against mercantilism. Why? Because free trade was supposed to be positive sum game. So according to David Hume and Adam Smith, if we want to enter free trade, then the situation has to be positive sum game. I win, you win. No one lose from the trade. And both of them are also believe in laissez-faire, and productivity becomes the source of the wealth of nation. If you look briefly at these following maps, then you will recognize that many countries in this world were independent after the Second World War. But before the World War, those countries, most of the countries, especially in Asia and Africa, as well as in Latin America, was belong to European countries, was belong to the colonials. And mercantilism period that was happened during 16th, 17th to 18th centuries left behind so many conflicts, inequalities, as well as social problems, especially in African continents. Now let's move to the 1760s, where the first industrial revolution happened in England. So industrial revolution was the transition to new manufacturing processes, and this was happened between 1760s to around 1840s. Before the Industrial Revolution, everything has to be made using our own hands. But after the Industrial Revolution, there comes the new manufacturing processes in a way that we can produce so many things in a relatively short period of time using less human labor, but with the increasing productivity rate. Scientific progress, the invention of steam engine, as well as other invention in science and technology, were becoming the major factor leading to industrial revolution. The main driver of the industrial revolution was the steam engine because it can transform and increase the capacity of manufacturing processes, especially in textile industry and transportation. In England, for example, cities like Manchester and Liverpool were quite famous for industrialization because Manchester was the center of textile industries back then, and then the product were transferred to Liverpool through railroad and canals. And then from there, the products of England textile manufacturer being exported to many other countries. So essentially, the invention of steam engine induced process of technological advancement or technological innovation in other industries connected to the one that powered by the engine, like the textile industries as well as the transportation sector. The consequences of the Industrial Revolution was the increasing demand for coal. Coal was widespread before the Industrial Revolution because of the shortage of charcoal that was made from woods. So the increasing demand for fuel in many industries requires people to find something as an alternative of charcoal. That's why coal came along as a solution to fuel the steam engine. And with Industrial Revolution, the use of coal as main fuel increased dramatically. This is the time when the atmospheric carbon concentration began to increase significantly due to human economic activities. Let's move on to the other part of the world, the United States of America. Before the Green Revolution, there was a question regarding Malthusian theory of population, and particularly the question on how to improve livelihood of rural people. Green Revolution was happened in the US because of the increasing production of crops, especially in developing countries, because the use of fertilizer, pesticides, and high-yield varieties. And this came as a result of the establishment of research center like International Rice Research Institute, IRRI, in the Philippines, and then International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMMYT. So what are the positive impacts of Green Revolution? Obviously, Green Revolution will promote higher agricultural production. It will also bring us the food security. It will increase the livelihood of farmers as well as become the basis for non-farm economic activities. On the other hand, the Green Revolution also bring the negative impacts to the society as well, because due to the Green Revolution, we became too dependent on chemicals in food production. we relied on pesticides and chemical fertilizers. And the intensive use of natural resources, especially soil and water, also contribute to significant rate of deforestation, especially in the developing countries. As a result of deforestation, obviously, it will also decrease our biodiversity and degrade our ecosystem as well. And because of the use of chemicals, it also raised the health risk for farmers and us consumers. Nowadays, we have to deal with globalization, financial, and trade liberalization. Our world has becoming highly connected, and everything is now being digital. As a result of globalization, obviously, digital revolution is everywhere. We are now being connected to anyone around the world. And as a result of globalization as well, we now enjoy the lower transportation costs. We can travel anywhere relatively cheap. We can also send something to anywhere around the world with relatively cheap as well. Now, economic globalization happened in 1990s because of the emergence of World Trade Organization, WTO, as well as multilateral agreements and bilateral agreements between countries. Financial liberalization is also happened in many countries, like for example in Indonesia, financial liberalization came as a result of the economic crisis in 1997-1998. So it changed everything, including not only our financial sector, but also our manufacturing sector as well. Every country nowadays has become the part of global supply chain. The positive impacts of globalization, financial, and trade liberalization are, for example, it increased the economic opportunities for developing countries. It also helped many people, especially the poor, to out of poverty line. Globalization, financial liberalization, and trade liberalization is also contributing to increase our economic efficiency because of the comparative advantage. It also spread the norms of human rights like democracy, equality, gender equality, transparency, accountability, and global citizenships. But then globalization, financial liberalization, and trade liberalization also comes with negative impacts as well. It can help some people to out of the poverty line, but it can also contribute to worsen the inequality problem. Globalization also tend to benefit the foreign corporation and migrants and hurt local enterprises and local laborers. Globalization has been also accused for changing local culture and way of life. Usually, it broke the bad cultural influences. Globalization also has been criticized for magnifying and expanding the impact of economic and financial crisis since the world is connected to each other. Now, when we look back at the global sustainability movement, this kind of movement is actually quite new. So in 1962, Rachel Carson published a book entitled Silent Spring. In 1972, there was the establishment of UNEP, and in 1987 came the Brundtland Report entitled Our Common Future. I think this is the first time when we began to talk about sustainability issues in a global environment. And then in 1922, there was a Rio Conference 1992, followed by the establishment of UNFCCC and Agenda 21. In 1997, there was Kyoto Protocol. In 2000, there was a Millennium Development Goals. In 2008, there was the establishment of IPCC, followed by Rio +20 conference in 2012. And in 2015, there was a Paris 2015 conference that resulted in the Sustainable Development Goals. So compared to the human civilization that has been around for 1,000 years, sustainability movement is relatively very young. As I said in my previous videos, SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals are the global development goals proposed by the United Nations, to which 193 countries politically committed on September 25th, 2015. And the period of SDGs is 2016 until 2030. That's why SDGs is also called Agenda 2030. These are the 17th agenda of Sustainable Development Goals, from no poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, renewable energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reduce inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, as well as partnership for the goals. And the spirit of SDGs nowadays is about leaving no one behind. Previously in MDGs or Millennium Development Goals, we were mostly focused on the environmental sustainability. But with SDGs, we are also focusing on the economic as well as the social aspect too. So as I mentioned in my previous videos, Sustainable Development Goals consist of 17 goals, 169 targets, divided into 232 indicators. And we are focusing not only on our environment or our planet, but also on people, on prosperity, on peace, as well as on partnership. Because without comprehensive agenda like this, then Sustainable Development Goals won't be possible. As I said in my previous slide, we have 17 topics of sustainable development. We have 169 targets that identify scope of each particular SDGs, and this is details and become the content of the SDGs. And to make sure that everything is happening in accordance with our Agenda 2030, we need indicators to measure progress of the SDG targets. Those 232 indicators consist of metadata of some indicators. Even though some have not been specified, most indicators can be used to reflect some particular aspect of our target. In SDGs, we classified into 3 different indicators. The first tier was where definition and methodology available. Number of countries collecting the data is more than 50%, and the data was being collected regularly. In Tier 2, definition and methodology has been described clearly. Number of countries collecting the data is less than 50%, and the data collected is not regular. But in Tier 3, definition and methodology is still being developed. So in SDGs, we also have to deal with different major groups of stakeholders, from business and industry, children and youth, farmers, indigenous people, local authorities, NGOs, scientific and technological communities, women and children, as well as workers and trade unions. There were 5 principles behind Sustainable Development Goals, like inclusive development, where we leave no one behind, universal development, where we focus on developing our agenda in every country, not only in developed countries, but also in less developed or emerging countries as well. Another principle is integrated development. We focus on the 17 goals and 169 targets and those are indivisible. They are interlinked in some ways, and we have to focus on all of those goals and targets all together, because the interconnecting goals and target need to be taken care of in an integrated manner. We also have to be focused on local development using bottom-up approach, transformative partnership, and participation from all stakeholders. And finally, we can also utilize technology to drive development agenda, because using the technologies like, for example, technology in agriculture, technology in data science, machine learning, Internet of Things, and so on and so forth, can help us to solve sustainable problems. Obviously, with the coming of SDGs, we want to achieve net zero emission, but we will need all the available policy solution. We need to rapidly expand renewable energy. This is what we call by raising the floor. But at the same time, we have to reduce overall energy use through energy efficiency and reduce consumption. This is what we call by lowering the ceiling. Eventually, raising the floor and lowering the ceiling will meet at the same point. On the other hand, we have to massively expand carbon sequestration in forests, soil, and wetlands. We also have to combine lower energy emission to zero and increase carbon sequestration to achieve net zero or even negative emissions. And this is something that can be done, to be honest. But we have to deal with the fact that we are now facing unforeseen challenges. Mass consumption and economic growth, particularly in high economic countries, in highly developed countries, are sustained by asymmetric exchange relationship with less developed countries. Ecologically unequal exchange rests on and may reinforce economic inequality between countries, especially the developed countries versus the developing countries. And considering asymmetric global resource flow is key to understanding how market exchange can obscure inequalities, but policy instruments for mitigating ecologically unequal exchange are non-existent at this moment. So it seems impossible for less developed countries to be able to catch up by assessing even poorer regions from which to appropriate resources. And I think this will become the major challenges if we want to pursue sustainability and production in one place. I want to diverge you to another topic for a moment, which was called Orientalism. So Orientalism was a book published by Edward Said, Palestinian scholars who are focusing on the difference power between developed countries and developing countries. This publication is an eclectic study of how the Western colonial powers represented and ruled North African and Middle Eastern land from the 18th century. And the term Orientalism refers to the sum of the West's representation of the Orient, a cultural and political vision of reality whose structure promoted the difference between the familiar, Europe, the West, or us, and the strange, the Orient, the East, or them. This work is also a theorization and manifestation of how colonial discourses might operate specific to particular historical and colonial contexts. So even though Edward Said has focused on North African countries and Middle East, the idea of Orientalism is also relevant to the other part of the world, like Caribbean countries, Latin America, as well as Asia. For Edward Said, despite the formal decolonization of many countries, the persistence of Orientalist representations reinforce the point that the imaginative machinery of colonialism does not quickly disappear as soon as once colonized lands achieve independence and can indeed endure in refreshed forms. So even though many countries in North Africa and Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America, in Caribbean, and things like that have achieved their independence, Orientalism and colonialism were still there. So inspired by the classic book of Edward Said, it is important for us to analyze sustainability discourses as a method of control and possession. Contemporary sustainable discourses contemplate the human values practices that regard the control, exploitation, and management of raw materials, food, and energy throughout specific habitats. Thinking about sustainability means that we have to take into account the political debate about a sustainable development in the world and their multifarious consequences. This is the picture from Altantropa in 1920. It represents the way in which developed countries actually exploit resources from the developing countries. So resources from countries like Africa or Asia was being exploited and taken by the European colonials, and they enjoy the economic benefit from those resources, while the developing countries or poor countries will still have to deal with their own problems. And the idea of sustainable Orientalism can help us to examine a current dilemma for the emerging territories around the world, whether to follow or interrogate the representation, visions, discourses, practices, and values towards a sustainable development originated on the countries with very high standards of human development indicators, most of them in Europe and in Anglo-America. And from this, we know the distinction between North and South. Northern countries usually rich countries, developed countries that enjoyed economic development for so many years, while southern part of the world will usually represent less developed countries, emerging countries, developing countries that still have to deal with developmental issues like education, transportation, infrastructure, economic development, and so on and so forth. So because of this, scholars came with an idea of degrowth or steady state. So what is degrowth? As an economy experiences exponential economic growth, it will eventually outstrip our ecological carrying capacity. It will result in a reduction in our ecological resilience. The size of the economy will reach a peak and then a period of degrowth occurs, either as a result of conscious policy, this is what we want, or due to an overshoot and collapse syndrome, this is what we don't want. Eventually, the system stabilizes at a new, though lower carrying capacity, and once the size of the economy falls below that carrying capacity, an economic steady state can be maintained. A particular steady state level need not be indefinite. So it means that as our ecological condition change, we can also adjust our economic activity upward or downward as we need. That's the basic idea of steady state or degrowth. For some scholars, they believe that economic growth is not sustainable, but human progress without economic growth is still possible. The key demand for this are voluntary and equitable degrowth, the extension of human relations instead of market relation, and the seeking higher human well-being through sustainable means. We will talk about that one by one later on. And degrowth should be achieved through democratic means and participative planning, and such planned degrowth is understood in contrast to a recession or unplanned degrowth. So we want to achieve degrowth deliberately, not because of the consequences of collapsing our ecological or our economic system. There are several degrowth response. The first one is the win-win between production and environment was very unlikely. That's why in the beginning of this video, I said that this is very difficult to teach or to deliver this subject because philosophically, production and environment, production and sustainability are contradictory with each other. And secondly, measurement of well-being is currently based on wrong indicators. GDP as the indicator that we use everywhere has serious shortcomings. So what are the underlying conditions that cement the current growth regime? First, property regime, economic or political condition, and second is cultural attitudes. To make these things happen, obviously, we will need a shift in our perspective. The point is not about hope busting or abysmal thinking. The point is about if we want to go beyond sustained unsustainability, so we need to deliver a better understanding of why we frame and act on issues the way we do. Conceptually, this means that challenging dominant framings of socio-ecological change, underpinning given initiative, as well as pushing existing interpretative lenses on local experiments. Empirically, this means reconstructing the notion of subjectivities and identities, the scientific knowledge and values underpinning local experiment in socio-ecological change, as well as their embeddedness in process of governing. Without this shift in our perspective, then pursuing degrowth will not be possible. So now let's come back to the idea of sustainable development. Sustainable development was a concept that emerged in the 1980s because the world back then believed that economic growth could finally be integrated with the environment. Back then, the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, ICUN, published the World Conservation Strategy with the cooperation of the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, and the World Wildlife Fund, WWF. This became the first strategic international undertaking to place the concept of sustainable development on the agenda. In 1980, the World Conservation Strategy comes up. According to IUCN Section 1, humanity's relationship with the biosphere will continue to deteriorate until a new international order is achieved, a new environmental ethic is adopted, human population stabilize, and sustainable modes of development become the rule rather than the exception. For development to be sustainable, it must take account of social and ecological factors, as well as economic ones. So triple bottom line, of the living and non-living resource base, and of the long-term as well as short-term advantages and disadvantages of alternative action. So that's why we are very familiar with this triple bottom line, social aspect, environmental aspect, as well as our economic aspect. In social aspect, we want to nurture our community. In environmental aspect, we want to have a viable natural environment. With the economic, we want to have a sufficient economic condition. And by pursuing all of these three aspects, we will have sustainable development. Now, in 1987, there was World Commission on Environment and Development. Sustainable development means that we want to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This was coming from the Our Common Future or the Brundtland report that have been discussed in our earlier session. Now, the big question is that whether we can have it all, profit, planet, and social. Can we have a sustainable development along with economic development? Because according to our common future, we want to meet the needs of the present, of the current generation, without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. And philosophically, this is very, very difficult to solve. Now let's move on to the degrowth principle. When we are talking about the economy, it essentially talk about aggregating monetized activities done by people. Economic growth and the dominant organizing principle of the economy is as follows. According to Pirani, the driving forces for economic expansion lie in the constant urge of capital to accumulate. Capitalism survives by over-accumulating capital and finding new frontiers in which to put it. It needs to eliminate all spatial barriers and can only do this through the production of fixed space via long-term infrastructural projects. It thus requires dispossession of territory for spatial fixes. These are the dominant organizing principle of the economy, that if you take a look at this principle very carefully, it is quite contradict the sustainable principle. We also have to take into account the neoliberalism that have been discussed earlier. Neoliberal globalization is the production of space for capital fixation, and it is based on the transnationalization of corporations from many origins. Economic activities are now being transnationalized in an effort to generate profit margin for investors so that they can enjoy profitability, they can enjoy the capital appreciation, capital gain, and things like that. And if we look at the critical theory, it doesn't take institutions and social and power relation for granted, but calls them into questions by concerning itself with their origins and whether they might be in the process of changing. Common sense in this area is defined as an ideological construction in which the interests of the dominant class are represented as the general interest of all, while the social and moral claims of working people and the poor are reduced to the pleadings of special interests, which must be resisted in order to ensure the smooth continuation of capital accumulation. Again, if we want to accumulate capital, then obviously we have to sacrifice the environment as well as the people or the social. Joseph Stiglitz a few years ago stated that the problem is a lot of what is called economics is not actually economics. It is much more about ideology or religion. So again, that's why it is very important for us to change our perspective, because what we are currently doing probably does not what we really meant to be. I also want to talk about the idea of cultural hegemony from Antonio Gramsci. It is the idea that the dominant ideology of society reflects that of the ruling class. The dominant ideology justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural, inevitable, perpetual, and beneficial for everyone, rather than as artificial social construct that benefit only the ruling class. A Gramscian understanding of hegemony takes it to mean both coercion and consent are wielded to control the private sphere, which reinforce control in the public sphere. It promotes authority based on intellectual and moral leadership rather than pure domination. I also want to introduce you with the concept of the Overton window. Overton window is the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. The window frames the range of policies that a politician can recommend without appearing too extreme to gain or keep public office given the climate of public opinion at that time. I think this is very important to understand because by understanding the idea of the Overton window, we can finally understand why some policies are not happening or some policies are not resulting in what we want. Because politicians will try to find their own Overton window. And if we look at the idea of sustainable development or the idea of the degrowth, for example, some of those ideas can be not so popular. Some of those ideas can be too radical and make some people unhappy. That's why it is quite difficult to promote sustainable development as well as degrowth agenda. I think this figure illustrates what happened today. We are now being bombarded with materialistic things, materialistic culture. We have our needs, but we still have to buy more things. Even though we already have everything in our life, we still have to increase our consumption. We still have to buy things. We still have to own many things. Why? Because economic development is important in this area to promote growth and growth and growth and growth, where eventually it will sacrifice our planet as well as our people. I'm sure some of you or most of you are also familiar with the idea of minimalism or minimalism movement, where people try to focus on fewer things that are essential to their life rather than pursuing something and increasing their consumption. And over the last 30 years in the USA alone, the top 1% has grown $21 trillion richer, while the bottom 50% have grown $900 billion poorer. This pattern of widening inequality is also repeated itself across the world. And especially during the pandemic, the rate of inequality is also becoming bigger. What we now know is that the economics that made me so rich, according to Nick Hanauer, is not just wrong, it's backwards, because it turns out it isn't capital that creates economic growth. It is people, and it isn't self-interest that promotes the public good. It's reciprocity. And it isn't competition that produces our prosperity, but cooperation. What we can now see is that an economic that is neither just nor inclusive can never sustain the high level of social cooperation necessary to enable a modern society to thrive. If you've got plenty of time, I would suggest you to watch this video because it can help you to understand the idea of degrowth, the idea of reducing our consumption, and so on and so forth. In my previous slide, I also mentioned that we are now using the wrong indicators, which was GDP. So where did the idea of GDP came from? The idea of GDP came into existence after the Great Depression and Second World War. GDP was first developed by Simon Kuznets for a United States Congress report in 1934. His idea was actually to calculate all economic production by individuals, companies, and government in a single measure. So the focus is only on economic production. GDP is a gross tally of products and services bought and sold with no distinction between transactions that add to well-being and those that diminish it. So we don't care about well-being at all. GDP assumes that every monetary transaction adds to well-being by its definition. GDP treats crime and natural disasters as economic gain because it can increase with polluting activities and then again with cleanups. GDP also ignores the non-market economy of household and community. So if we do barter with each other, there won't be recorded as a transaction in GDP. GDP is also takes no account of income distribution. So average does not equal typical. That's why GDP is becoming the wrong indicators because it doesn't represent the inequality between the rich and the poor. GDP and environment is also quite contradictory. In 1992, the report of the Council on Environmental Quality stated that accounting system used to estimate GDP do not reflect depletion or degradation of the natural resources used to produce goods and services. So actually, GDP represents ecological breakdown as economic gain. But more importantly, GDP does not measure well-being. GDP doesn't care about our economic well-being. It doesn't care about our living condition. It also doesn't care about our happiness. While actually in our life, happiness is much more important, living condition is also much more important than our economic well-being only. We have to think about, for example, our family, our friendship, our relationship, our work satisfaction, our communities, our health, our environment, our education, and things like that, rather than only on the consumption and economic production. So again, GDP is not a good measure of economic performance, according Joseph Stiglitz. He said that it is not a good measure of well-being as well. So that's why we need to focus on other perspective. We need to focus on other indicators, and we also have to use different kind of logic. The prevailing logic of forever higher, faster, further, more is no longer relevant because the rate of growth is exponential and constant growth on a finite planet will be dangerous for us. Neoliberal economic theory has sold itself to you as unchangeable natural law, when in fact it is social norms and constructed narrative based on pseudoscience. If we truly want a more equitable, more prosperous, and more sustainable economy, if we want high-functioning democracies and civil society, then we must have a new economics. So we really have to change the way we think. Now, who is to blame if we want to? First, extractivism has been a mechanism of colonial and neo-colonial plunder and appropriation. This extractivism was forged in the exploitation of the raw material essential for the industrial development and prosperity of the global north. Neoliberal globalization is based on the globalization of capitalist relation. This is also the other thing that we have to blame. Actors at each level of agency are facilitated to interact with each other. Capital is a dominant social relation, meaning that it possesses a dominant social role impacting how agents interact with one another. After the Second World War, there was significant restructuring of the global economy, the so-called neoliberal turn, and within this era emerged a new form of subordination of the state to the dynamic of transnational capital. The production of scale associated with the neoliberal turn has profoundly disrupted the previous existing hierarchies between global and national levels in favor of a subordination of the national to the global. Transnational corporations have become dominant actors, displacing nation-states as leaders in processes of capital accumulation. So, extractivism, neoliberal globalization, neoliberal turn, and transnational corporation are those that we can blame for this situation. If we want to pursue degrowth, then we have to make sure that these three key elements are there: conviviality, dematerialization, and simplicity. Degrowth is a planned reduction of total energy and material use to bring the economy in line with planetary boundaries, while improving people's life by distributing income and resources more fairly. In 1970s, there was limits to growth debate. Club of Rome report in 1972 came with these two conclusions. First, if the present trends in growth of population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continued unchanged, then the limits to growth on this planet would be reached within the next 100 years or 2072. The second conclusion is that it is possible to alter these growth trends and to establish a condition of ecological and economic stability that is sustainable for the future. Then the question is whether we want to or whether we don't want to do that. I also want to introduce you with the Prosperity Without Growth, Economics for a Finite Planet by Tim Jackson. It was first published as a report to the UK government in 2009 and rapidly became a landmark in the sustainability debate. The book has been translated into 17 foreign languages, and in that book, he wrote the idea of conventional economics. And in that book, he questioned the most highly prized goal of politicians and economists alike. There is the continued pursuit of exponential economic growth. The book also provoked controversy, inspired debate, and led to a new wave of research building on its arguments and conclusions. So according to Kate Raworth, she did a kind of this experiment. If we are focusing only on our economic activity or our GDP, then we will soon reach our planetary boundaries. But if we focus on greener growth or green growth, then it is possible for us to sustain our resources or our planet. But then it will require our effort to decouple resources with economic activities. As we know, GDP is not a good indicator to measure our well-being. That's why the GPA comes in. The GPI takes into account more than 20 aspects of our economic lives that the GDP ignores. The GPI includes estimate of the economic contribution of numerous social and environmental factors, which the GDP dismisses with an implicit and arbitrary value of 0. The GPI also differentiates between economic transactions that add to well-being and those which diminish it. The GPI then integrates these factors into a composite measure so that the benefits of economic activity can be weighed against the costs. Another indicator that can be used is GNH, or Gross National Happiness. This was introduced by the fourth king, His Majesty Jigme Singye Wangchuck, in 1972. GNH has become a vision of human development. GNH tries to balance between material and spiritual development. It is also more holistic, bring more balanced approach to development. GNH believes that the aspiration of happiness unites all people and cultures. And in 2008, it becomes the part of the Constitution of Bhutan. The Constitution states that to promote those conditions that will enable the pursuit of gross national happiness. Another indicator that we can use is Happy Planet Index. The Happy Planet Index measures what matters, sustainable well-being for all. It tells us how well nations are doing at achieving long, happy, and sustainable lives. And what I just said earlier about the critics on GDP, the critics on consumption, overconsumption, the idea of degrowth and pursuing more realistic sustainability and so on and so forth are actually happens everywhere. You can find lots of news, you can find lots of talks, debates, and things like that on that particular issues. And I think we have to take into account those issues in our activities. And finally, we have to take into account the power of youth as well. And the focus of attention is leading a sufficient life at the personal level because young environmentalists feel a greater need for direct effectiveness. You know Greta Thunberg, right? Anyone who is able to change their own eating habits, travel, or consumer behavior to be more environmentally friendly and sustainable immediately learns that some things can be changed in the here and now, even if their true effectiveness is often left unclear. We also know that young people appear to have lost confidence in rapid, effective change at the political level, and adopting a sustainable lifestyle enables them to recapture part of their own effectiveness. So that's why it is also important for us to invest in young generation, because young generation usually tend to focus more sustainable issues, tend to focus on organic product, fair trade, developmental issues, and so on and so forth. So I think that's all for today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to see you in the next session.